She said I didn't belong on my own street. Then she called the police on my grocery bags. My neighbors watched and said nothing at all. I cried alone in my kitchen that night. 6 months later, everything I owned was almost gone. But she never knew who my husband really was. Because when the truth surfaced, she lost everything. This is the story of the HOA officer who picked the wrong family. My name is Maya Whitfield, and until last spring, I believed a house with a white picket fence in Brookstone Estates was the finish line, not the starting gun. I'm a pediatric nurse. My husband Marcus is a high school history teacher, and after 12 years of marriage and 2 moves overseas, we finally bought a home we could call permanent. Marcus spent 9 years as a Navy Master-at-Arms before he traded a sea bag for a classroom. He doesn't talk much about his service, he just carries it, quiet and steady, the way some men carry a badge they never show unless they have to. I never imagined our new neighborhood would be the place that finally tested it. Brookstone Estates looked like a postcard. Matching mailboxes, trimmed hedges, cul-de-sacs lined with flags. The welcome packet from the Homeowners Association was 50 pages of rules about mulch color and trash bin placement. I laughed reading it. HOAs aren't about landscaping, he said. They're about who gets to decide what's normal. We met Deborah Sinclair on our 3rd day, clipboard in hand, introducing herself as the HOA compliance officer before she'd even said hello. She wore a lanyard with a laminated badge, like she worked for the county. Something about the badge felt theatrical, though I couldn't say why yet. I just smiled and shook her hand. Debbie complimented our house, then immediately noted our porch swing, technically violated Section 4.2 of the bylaws. I promised to check. Since we're new, in a tone that made clear this was a favor, not a courtesy. Marcus watched her walk away and said nothing. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a pattern. Debbie's name was on every flyer, every violation notice, every reminder email blasted to the whole neighborhood. No other board member's name appeared anywhere. When I asked a neighbor who else served on the board, she just shrugged. Debbie basically is the board, she said. I found that strange but not alarming. Every neighborhood has one person who cares too much about lawn edges. What did alarm me, slightly, was how differently she treated houses. The Kowalski's overgrown hedge got a friendly note. Our slightly late trash bin got a certified letter. I chalked it up to bad luck at first. Marcus started keeping the HOA newsletters in a folder. Habit, he said, when I teased him. He'd done small unit administrative work in the Navy audits, inventory, paperwork nobody wanted to read closely. He read closely. I just thought my husband liked being organized. One Saturday, Debbie stopped her golf cart at our curb while I watered the garden. She asked, almost casually, where Marcus worked security. She'd seen his old command ball cap in the truck. I said he was a teacher and a veteran. Her smile flickered, just for a second, before it reset. A veteran, she repeated, like she was filing it away for later use rather than admiration. I didn't understand that look yet. At the time I thought she was just making conversation. Looking back, I think she was already deciding how useful or how threatening that fact might become to her. The first real friction came over our driveway. We'd parked Marcus's truck and my sedan side by side for 2 days while we unloaded moving boxes. Debbie left a note calling it excessive vehicle presence. Our neighbors, the Coopers, had 3 cars parked the same way for a month. No note ever appeared on their door. I mentioned the double standard to a neighbor at the mailbox, carefully testing the water. She lowered her voice like we were discussing something illegal. "Debbie decides who gets flexibility," she said. "You don't want to be on her list." I asked what happened if you were on the list. She wouldn't answer. I started paying closer attention after that. Debbie's violation notices always arrived exactly on the 5th day of a grace period, time to feel aggressive rather than helpful. Her tone in emails swung between saccharine and clipped, depending on who she was writing to. With us, it was never saccharine. Marcus began video recording our own yard just in case, mounting a cheap trail camera under the eave. I asked if he was being paranoid. He said 30 years of HOA disputes online had taught him one lesson. People like Debbie always escalate, and receipts are the only thing that stops them. I wanted to believe he was overreacting. I wanted this neighborhood to be the calm, ordinary place the brochure promised. 2 black professionals with steady jobs, a paid mortgage, and manicured grass. I thought that was armor enough. I didn't yet understand that, in Debbie's mind, none of that mattered as much as who got to define belonging. The real turning point came from something small. Debbie asked, in front of 3 other neighbors, whether we were renting or actually owning our house. The question hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Marcus answered flatly that we owned it outright. Debbie laughed it off as just curious, but no one else laughed. That night Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his old Navy ID card and our closing documents spread in front of him, like he was building a case file out of habit. "She's going to come for us," he said quietly. "Not because we did anything wrong. Because we didn't ask for permission to exist here." The first real explosion happened over a garden gnome. My grandmother's ceramic rooster, a housewarming gift, sat by our front steps for exactly 1 afternoon before Debbie's golf cart screeched to a stop. She marched up our walkway without knocking, snapped a photo, and announced the rooster violated the uniform frontage aesthetic clause. I explained it was decorative and temporary, a gift I hadn't found a spot for yet. Debbie said rules were rules, and reminded me, unprompted, that some neighborhoods let things slide until they don't look like neighborhoods anymore. I felt my face go hot. Marcus, behind me, simply asked her to leave our porch. Debbie didn't leave. Clipboard against her chest, and said she had every right to inspect common adjacent areas. Marcus calmly informed her our porch wasn't common property. It was ours. She stared at him like he'd broken some unspoken rule by disagreeing. Then she turned and walked away without a word. The written violation arrived the next morning, citing not just the rooster but unauthorized confrontation of an HOA officer. I read that line 3 times. We hadn't confronted anyone. We'd asked her to leave our own porch. Marcus photographed the notice before filing it in his growing folder. "Exhibit 1, he muttered, half joking, half not. I called the HOA's general email to dispute the fine, expecting a form response. Instead, Debbie herself replied, personally, within 20 minutes, impressively fast for someone who supposedly wasn't the only board member. Her email was polite on its face but laced with warnings about patterns of noncompliance that could affect future standing in the community. Marcus asked to see the HOA's official roster of board members and their voting authority. The request vanished into silence for a week. When Debbie finally responded, she said the information was internal and only shared as needed. That answer, more than anything so far, told him something was being protected that shouldn't have been. We paid the rooster fine just to end it. $45 felt cheaper than a fight. But paying it seemed to embolden her. Within days, a new notice appeared. Our mailbox post was half an inch off the approved height. I hadn't even known there was an approved height. Apparently only Debbie did. A neighbor, Renee, pulled me aside at the community pool and admitted she'd once challenged Debbie over a fence color dispute years earlier. She had my car towed from my own driveway the next week, Renee whispered. Said it was a safety hazard. I never fought her again. I didn't sleep well that night. Marcus started attending the monthly HOA meetings, which were sparsely attended and, tellingly, always ran by Debbie alone at a folding table in the clubhouse. He asked, politely, when the last board election had been held. Debbie said a while back, and quickly moved to the next agenda item before anyone could press further. That non-answer stuck with him. He'd served on shipboard committees where every vote, every term, every signature was documented in triplicate. A homeowners association claiming millions of dollars in shared assets with no visible election record didn't sit right with a man trained to notice missing paperwork. He started digging quietly. Meanwhile, the fines kept coming. A shed roof shade 1 tone off approved beige, a flowerbed edge encroaching onto the sidewalk buffer by 2 inches. Each notice was minor enough to seem petty if we complained, but together they formed a pattern clearly aimed only at our address. I began keeping my own folder too. I tried reasoning with Debbie directly, catching her at the mailboxes one morning. I asked, genuinely, what we'd done to deserve this level of scrutiny. She smiled thinly and said, I just hold everyone to the same standard. Maya, maybe you're not used to that where you're from. I didn't answer. Couldn't. Marcus heard about that comment that evening and went very still, the way he used to before a difficult deployment briefing. Where you're from, he repeated. We're from 3 streets over from our old rental. Maya. We both knew exactly what she'd meant, even if she never said the word out loud. The next weekend, someone slashed the tires on Marcus's truck while it sat in our own driveway. No note, no witness, no explanation, just 4 flat tires and a scratch along the door reading, unmistakably, go back. We called the police. It up as vandalism. Unknown suspect, and left within 20 minutes. I saw Debbie's golf cart parked 2 houses down that same morning, longer than any errand should take. I couldn't prove anything, and I told myself I was being paranoid, grasping at a villain because the truth, random hate, no HOA involved, felt too frightening to sit with. Marcus didn't say he agreed. He didn't say he disagreed either. He simply pulled the trail camera footage from under our eave. It didn't capture the tires. Wrong angle. But it did capture Debbie's golf cart idling at the curb at 6:14 a.m. Her phone raised toward our driveway for nearly 4 minutes before she drove off. It wasn't proof of the vandalism. It was proof she'd been watching. Marcus copied that footage onto 2 separate drives that night and said nothing to Debbie, nothing to the neighbors, nothing even to the police yet. You don't show your hand early, he told me, echoing something that sounded more like training than temperament. You wait until the hand actually matters. I had no idea how soon that would be. Word must have spread fast. Because by the following week, neighbors who'd never spoken to us started nodding stiffly instead of waving. Renee told me, guiltily, that Debbie had mentioned in the community Facebook group that our household had ongoing safety concerns, without specifying what that meant. Vague enough to scare people, specific enough to sound official. I finally saw the post myself. It never named us directly, but everyone in the comments knew exactly who it meant. Just a reminder to report any unusual activity to HOA leadership immediately, Debbie had written, right below a photo of our street. 31 likes. Everyone was safe. Nobody asked us anything. Marcus filed a formal request under the HOA's own bylaws for the minutes of the last 3 board meetings and a current, dated list of elected officers. He sent it by certified mail, the way you send something you expect to need later as evidence. Debbie didn't respond within the 14-day window the bylaws required. When the response finally came, 3 weeks late, it was 2 sentences long. Minutes were not currently available due to a records transition, and officer information was confidential per association policy. Marcus read it twice, then filed it in his folder beside the rest. No HOA operates like this legally, he said. Not for long. Anyway, the incident that finally made national forum threads happen on a Tuesday afternoon. I was carrying groceries from my car when Debbie pulled up, blocking my driveway with her golf cart, and demanded to see proof of residency, claiming she'd received reports of someone matching my description, casing the neighborhood. I stood there holding a gallon of milk. Stunned. I told her I lived there, that she'd been to our porch a dozen times already, that she knew exactly who I was. She said policy required verification regardless of familiarity, and called it in on her radio to someone I never saw, then dialed the non-emergency police line herself, describing me as a possible trespasser. Agitated. 2 patrol cars arrived within 8 minutes. I stood in my own driveway, groceries melting in the July heat, explaining to 2 officers that I lived in the house behind me while Debbie hovered nearby, arms crossed, nodding along like she'd done exactly the right thing. One officer checked my ID against the mailbox name. It matched instantly. The younger officer looked almost embarrassed as he apologized and left. Debbie, unbothered, told me this was for everyone's safety, and that she hoped I understood. I didn't trust myself to speak. I carried my groceries inside, set them on the counter, and sat on the kitchen floor and cried for the first time since we'd moved in. Marcus came home to find me still shaking. When I told him what happened, something in his face changed. Not rage. Something quieter and more dangerous. A stillness I recognized from stories he rarely told about tense situations overseas. He didn't raise his voice. He asked for the exact time, the badge numbers, the responding unit. He wrote it all down in a notebook. Methodical, unemotional, the way he'd once logged incident reports for a living. Then he said something that stuck with me for weeks. She just made a mistake she can't take back. Not because she's sorry. Because now there's a record. I didn't fully understand what he meant yet. The neighborhood forum exploded overnight. Someone had filmed part of the police encounter from across the street and posted it. No context. Just Debbie pointing and 2 officers standing near my car. Comments split instantly, half horrified, half insisting Debbie, must have had her reasons, and that people shouldn't jump to conclusions about a long-time resident. I read every comment, which I now know was a mistake. Strangers debated my worthiness to live in my own neighborhood like it was a court case with no judge. Renee finally commented publicly, gently defending me, and was met with a private message from Debbie within the hour. Renee showed it to me later, hands trembling slightly. The message read, in part, that loyalty to neighbors matters more than loyalty to newcomers, and reminded Renee that her own fence variance was still technically under review. Renee understood the threat immediately. She stopped commenting. I couldn't blame her, though something in me went cold realizing how many people Debbie could quietly control this way. Marcus began cross-referencing every HOA financial disclosure he could legally request, a right explicitly guaranteed under the state's Homeowners Association statute he'd printed out and highlighted. He found that the association's annual budget listed a landscaping contract nearly triple the going rate for a neighborhood this size, paid to a vendor with almost no public footprint. The vendor's name, Sinclair Grounds Solutions, made him sit back in his chair for a long moment. Same last name as Debbie. Could be coincidence, he told me carefully, not wanting to accuse without proof. But 30 years of Navy paperwork had taught him that coincidences involving money and matching surnames were worth watching closely, not dismissing. I wanted to march straight to the county and report everything immediately. Marcus talked me down, gently. If we go in loud and half-armed, she paints us as unstable troublemakers, he said. We need the full picture first. Every date, every dollar, every signature. Then it isn't a fight anymore. It's just facts. I hated how patient he sounded. In the meantime, the fines kept escalating. An improper mulch depth citation. An unauthorized exterior light fixture citation for a solar path light sold at every hardware store in town. Each fine came with a tighter deadline than the last. And each one, when I checked, cited a bylaw section that didn't actually exist in our copy of the handbook. I started requesting the specific bylaw text for every citation, forcing Debbie to either produce it or back down. She usually backed down quietly, rescinding fines without apology once pressed for documentation. It was a small, exhausting war fought one email at a time, and I began to understand why so many neighbors simply paid and stayed silent. Marcus reached out to a veterans legal aid clinic near the base, a resource he'd used once before helping a fellow sailor fight a predatory lease. The intake attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Priya, listened to our timeline and told us something that surprised me. HOA fraud and officer impersonation cases were far more common than people assumed, and often easier to prove than expected. Priya explained that if Debbie truly held no valid elected position, every fine, lien, and enforcement action she'd issued could potentially be void, not just for us, but for every household she'd ever fined. That single sentence reframed everything. This wasn't just our problem anymore. It was potentially the entire neighborhood's problem, and nobody else knew it yet. We started, carefully and quietly, talking to a few trusted neighbors, not to organize a mob, Marcus insisted, but to gather honest accounts. Renee admitted her towed car incident had never actually gone through a documented HOA vote. The Kowalskis admitted their hedge fine years ago had been paid directly to Debbie's personal Venmo, not an HOA account. That detail landed heavy in the room. A personal Venmo for an official HOA fine. Marcus asked, calmly, if anyone still had the payment confirmation. The Kowalskis, thankfully, kept meticulous tax records and found the transaction within minutes. Dated, time-stamped, sent directly to an account under the name Deborah A. Sinclair. No HOA entity attached anywhere. I started to feel something shift inside me, fear slowly giving way to something steadier. For weeks I'd felt like a target standing alone in an open field. Now I understood we weren't alone at all. We were simply the first people organized enough, and lucky enough, to have a husband trained to build a case instead of just an argument. Debbie, unaware of any of this, escalated anyway. A new notice arrived declaring our home in violation of community harmony standards due to excessive visitors, referring to my sister's single weekend visit. The fine was our steepest yet, $200, with language warning that continued violations could result in a lien against the property. A lien. 3 times before it fully registered. This woman was threatening to attach a legal claim to our house over my sister staying 2 nights. Marcus read the notice without visible reaction, folded it once, and placed it precisely on top of the growing stack in his folder. Let her file it, he said quietly. I asked why he wasn't more alarmed. He reminded me that liens require documented authority to file, board approval, and proper notice under state law, all things Debbie had never once produced despite multiple requests. She's about to put her signature on a legal document she has no authority to sign, he said. That's not a threat to us anymore. That's evidence, true to form. The lien notice arrived 11 days later, filed with the county under the Brookstone Estates Homeowners Association. Signed simply D. Sinclair, HOA Compliance Officer. No board resolution attached. No case number referencing an actual vote. Marcus photographed every page the moment it arrived. Hands steady, expression unreadable, like a man finally holding the card he'd waited for. Priya, the attorney, confirmed what Marcus suspected within a day of reviewing the filing. The lien was almost certainly invalid on its face, filed by someone with no documented authority to file anything on the association's behalf. She recommended we not fight it publicly yet. Let her keep going, she said. The deeper she digs, the harder it'll be to climb out. That advice tested every ounce of patience I had. Watching a threat like that sit unanswered on paper felt unbearable, like wading through an alarm you weren't allowed to silence. Marcus reminded me, gently, that patience wasn't the same as weakness. I spent years being trained to wait for the right moment instead of the satisfying one, he said. This is that training. Meanwhile, Debbie's confidence visibly grew. She began greeting neighbors at the mailbox with theatrical warmth, painting herself as the tireless guardian who'd finally stood up to a difficult household. A few longtime residents ate it up entirely, bringing her banana bread, thanking her for keeping standards up. Watching that performance from a distance made my stomach turn every time. I overheard her once, at the community garden, telling another resident that families like ours always test the rules first. See what they can get away with. The woman she said it to laughed uncomfortably and didn't correct her. I stood frozen behind a row of tomato plants, unseen, absorbing a version of myself I didn't recognize and never asked to become. Marcus noticed the toll it was taking on me before I admitted it myself. One night he sat across from me at the kitchen table, folder closed for once, and said quietly that none of this excused what she was doing, but that we needed to protect our peace too, not just build a case. We started taking short walks together, away from Brookstone entirely. On one of those walks, at a park 2 neighborhoods over, we ran into a man Marcus recognized instantly, Chief Petty Officer Alvarez, someone he'd served with years earlier, now working as an investigator for the County Consumer Protection Office. It felt almost too convenient to be real, the kind of coincidence you'd cut from a script for being unbelievable. But it happened. Alvarez listened to our story over coffee, visibly more interested with every detail about the Venmo payments and the unelected compliance officer title. He explained that HOA officer impersonation combined with unauthorized fee collection could rise to actual fraud charges, not just a civil dispute, especially if there was a documented pattern across multiple households, which there clearly now was. He offered to review whatever documentation we'd gathered, off the record at first, purely as a professional favor to an old shipmate. Marcus handed over copies that same week: the Venmo confirmation, the invalid lien, the vendor contract bearing the Sinclair name, the trail camera footage, even the certified letters that had gone conveniently unanswered for weeks at a time. Alvarez called 2 days later, his voice noticeably more formal than at the park. He said the pattern was concerning enough to open a preliminary inquiry, and asked whether we'd be willing to speak with other affected residents. Carefully, without tipping off Debbie before the inquiry had real footing. Marcus agreed immediately. I agreed too, though my hands were shaking. We began meeting Renee and the Kowalskis quietly, one evening at our kitchen table, laying out everything we knew like pieces of a puzzle nobody had ever assembled in one place before. Renee's towed car, our slashed tires, our false police call, our invalid lien. Separately, each story sounded like an unfortunate misunderstanding. Together, it looked like a pattern of abuse. Renee admitted something new that night, something she'd been too embarrassed to say earlier. Debbie had once implied, not so subtly, that Renee's biracial grandson made some neighbors uncomfortable, playing in the shared common area after dark, suggesting he stay closer to their own yard. Renee had never repeated it aloud until now, ashamed she hadn't spoken up sooner. Hearing that confirmed something I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to say out loud myself. This wasn't only about fines and fake titles. There was a pattern underneath the pattern, quieter and uglier, aimed specifically at who Debbie decided didn't belong. Marcus's jaw tightened when Renee said it, but he stayed quiet, writing the date and detail down without a word. By the end of that evening, we had 5 separate households willing to go on record, a preliminary county inquiry underway, and a folder thick enough that Marcus needed a second one to hold it all. Debbie, still blissfully unaware, posted a cheerful update in the neighborhood group that same night. Standards matter. Some of us just care more than others. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing happened. No notices, no golf cart stakeouts, no comments dressed up as concern. I almost let myself believe the worst had passed, that Debbie had finally overextended herself and quietly stepped back. Marcus didn't relax the same way. Storms don't apologize before they hit, he said. They just go quiet first. We used the calm to breathe. Marcus grilled on Sunday, actually laughing at something on television for the first time in weeks. My sister called, and I didn't spend the whole conversation venting about Brookstone Estates for once. Small, ordinary joys felt enormous again. The way water tastes different after you've gone a long time without it. Renee invited us over for dinner. The first real neighborhood gesture since everything began. Her husband grilled ribs. Her grandson showed Marcus a half-built model ship with the kind of pride only a kid can have. And for one evening, Brookstone Estates felt like the postcard neighborhood I'd imagined the day we signed the closing papers. Even the Kowalskis seemed lighter, joking that maybe Debbie had finally run out of houses to find. I laughed along, wanting badly to believe it. Marcus smiled too, but I noticed he still checked the trail camera footage every night before bed. Out of habit more than suspicion, he said. I wasn't sure I believed that explanation completely. Alvarez called with a quiet update. The county inquiry was moving, slower than any of us wanted, requiring formal document requests to the HOA's registered agent, a process that took weeks by design. He warned us that Debbie might sense something once those requests landed on her desk. People like this don't go down quietly, he said. Expect a reaction. I asked what kind of reaction. He said the honest answer was he didn't know. But in his experience, people who'd built their identity around control tended to escalate hardest right when that control started slipping. Marcus nodded like he'd already reached the same conclusion on his own. Weeks earlier, without needing anyone to say it aloud. We used those quiet days to prepare rather than relax completely. Marcus organized his folder into labeled sections: timeline, financial records, witness statements, video evidence, the same instinct that once kept a ship's paperwork audit ready at all times. I helped, typing summaries at the kitchen table late into the night while he cross-checked dates against county filings. One evening, almost as an afterthought, Marcus pulled an old photo from a drawer, himself in dress blues at a change of command ceremony, a folded flag in his arms, a look of quiet pride I rarely saw him wear day to day. I never needed anyone here to know this, he said, sliding it into the folder anyway. But I think we will now. I asked why now, specifically. He said proof of service sometimes shifted how officials and juries and neighbors treated a claim, fair or not, and he'd rather have it ready than need it and not have it. It wasn't vanity. The same cold clarity he brought to every difficult decision since I'd known him. The Kowalskis' teenage daughter, overhearing part of a conversation at their dinner table, mentioned something that made everyone go still. She'd seen Debbie's grown son, a man named Tyler, visiting more frequently lately, always carrying a laptop bag, always leaving with folders of his own. Nobody knew yet what that meant. Felt worth writing down regardless. Marcus asked Alvarez, carefully, whether the inquiry had turned up anything about Tyler Sinclair. Alvarez went quiet for a moment before admitting Tyler worked in IT for a local property management company. The same company, coincidentally, listed as a secondary contact on several HOA vendor documents. Another thread, sliding into an increasingly ugly picture. I started to feel the calm curdling into something more like held breath. Every peaceful dinner, every quiet evening, felt like the eye of a storm rather than its ending. Marcus agreed, though he tried not to say it too plainly, not wanting to steal the little piece we'd finally found for me before it was necessary. On the 13th quiet day, a county envelope arrived at our house by mistake. a courtesy copy of the formal document request sent to the HOA's registered agent, listing Deborah Sinclair by name and title, demanding proof of her authority within 15 business days. Marcus read it twice, then looked at me. "It's starting," he said simply. That night neither of us slept much. Not from fear this time, but from the strange, electric anticipation of finally watching something we'd built quietly for weeks begin to move on its own. Whatever calm Brookstone Estates had offered us those 2 weeks, we both understood, without saying it, that it had just officially ended. The formal county letter reached Debbie 2 days after our courtesy copy arrived. Renee saw her son Tyler's car in the driveway that same afternoon, staying until almost midnight. Whatever conversation happened behind those closed blinds clearly didn't calm her down. By the following morning, the neighborhood group had 3 new posts from Debbie, each angrier than the last. The first post warned vaguely of outside agitators trying to destabilize our community without naming us directly. The second implied certain households had filed baseless complaints out of personal vendettas. The third, posted at nearly 1 a.m., simply read, "I have given this neighborhood everything. Some people don't understand sacrifice." Comments flooded in, sympathetic and confused in equal measure. Marcus screenshotted every post methodically, timestamps intact, before Debbie could quietly delete them later, something he clearly expected, given how quickly he acted. "People who lie in public rarely let the lie sit there long," he said. "She'll scrub this the second she realizes it reads as unhinged instead of righteous." He was right within 18 hours. All 3 posts vanished by the next evening, replaced with a single calm message about an important community update coming soon. I asked Marcus what he thought that meant. He guessed, correctly as it turned out, that Debbie was preparing something bigger than social media damage control. Something designed to reassert her authority before it slipped away entirely. That something arrived as a flyer taped to every mailbox. An emergency HOA town hall, Thursday evening, clubhouse, to address recent misinformation threatening our community's integrity. No agenda attached. No mention of the county inquiry. Just Debbie's name at the bottom. Still signed compliance officer, a title we now knew she'd never officially held for over 3 years. We learned that detail from an unexpected source. Mrs. Alvarado, an elderly original homeowner who'd served on the very first Brookstone board 15 years ago. She found us at the mailbox, quietly furious, holding a yellowed printout of the last documented board election, one that listed Debbie as a regular member, not an officer, with a term that had expired in 2023. Mrs. explained that after the last legitimate president moved away, no formal election had ever been held again. Debbie had simply started signing documents with whatever title suited the moment, and enough people assumed someone official must be checking behind her that nobody ever did. "We got lazy," she admitted. And she counted on exactly that. Armed with Mrs. Marcus felt the last real gap in the timeline close. Not just an overzealous volunteer bending rules, but someone who had quietly self-appointed herself into unchecked authority for years, collecting fines under a title with no legal standing, filing liens with no board behind her, and controlling a neighborhood through nothing but unquestioned habit. Priya, once she saw the printout, called it the missing piece they'd needed for a clean fraud case rather than a messy civil dispute. She recommended attending Thursday's town hall, saying nothing publicly yet, simply observing and documenting whatever Debbie tried to push through in front of witnesses. Let her build the trap herself, she said. You just need to watch her step into it. Thursday came faster than I wanted it to. The clubhouse was packed tighter than any meeting we'd attended before, word having spread that something significant was coming. Debbie stood at the front in a blazer that looked almost like a uniform, a gavel, an actual gavel, for an HOA meeting, resting beside her folder of prepared remarks. She opened by thanking everyone for their patience during a difficult season, then pivoted immediately into describing a household that had repeatedly harassed HOA leadership and spread false accusations to outside agencies. She never said our names. She didn't need to. And at some point, toward where Marcus and I sat near the back, I felt exposed in a way that made my pulse pound in my ears. But Marcus's hand found mine under the table, steady, unbothered, the same grip he'd probably used to calm younger sailors during their worst nights at sea. Let her talk, he whispered.
Every word she says right now is going.
Debbie proposed a motion, voted on by a show of hands from whoever happened to be present that night. No proxy, no quorum requirement mentioned, to formally censure our household and pursue maximum enforcement on all outstanding fines, including the disputed lien. Several hands went up immediately, loyalists nodding along like they'd rehearsed the gesture beforehand. Before the vote could be finalized, an older man near the front stood up unexpectedly. Mr. Alvarado, Mrs. Alvarado's husband, a founding resident few people even remembered still lived in the neighborhood. He asked, in a voice that carried despite its age, exactly what authority Debbie held to call any vote at all. The room went noticeably quieter. Debbie's composure cracked for just a moment. A flicker Marcus later said reminded him of watching a junior sailor get caught in a lie during inspection. The eyes dart, the shoulders square defensively, before the mask slides back into place. She said her authority was well established and moved to close the vote before further questions. Mr. Down. Established by who? He pressed. I served on the last real board. I don't remember voting for you as anything but a member. A murmur rippled through the clubhouse. Uncertain, uncomfortable, the sound of a room realizing it might have trusted the wrong person for longer than anyone wanted to admit. Debbie adjourned the meeting abruptly, gavel banging once. Sharply, she left through the side door before most people could even stand. Tyler suddenly appearing at her elbow like he'd been waiting nearby the whole time. Renee caught my eye across the room, wide-eyed, and mouthed a single word, wow. It felt like the first real crack in a wall we'd been quietly chipping at for months. The retaliation came faster than any of us expected. 2 days later, a police officer knocked on our door asking to speak with Marcus alone regarding a report of threatening behavior filed against him by Debbie, claiming he had cornered her in the clubhouse parking lot after the meeting and made comments she perceived as intimidating and violent. I stood frozen in the doorway as Marcus, calm as ever, agreed to answer questions without hesitation, without a lawyer even, because he genuinely had nothing to hide and, more importantly, our own trail camera had automatically synced a wide-angle clip of that exact parking lot exchange to the cloud less than an hour after it happened. The footage showed Marcus walking calmly to our car, Debbie following him uninvited, gesturing sharply while he simply kept walking, never raising his voice, never turning around aggressively, eventually just saying, "Ma'am, I have nothing further to say to you," before getting in and driving away. No cornering. Just a woman chasing a silent man across a parking lot. The officer reviewed the clip on Marcus's phone right there on our porch. His expression shifting from procedural neutrality to something closer to visible discomfort. He apologized for the inconvenience, noted in his report that the footage did not support the complaint, and left without further action. Marcus thanked him politely, closed the door, and finally let his shoulders drop. I asked how he'd stayed so calm through all of it, watching a stranger with a badge stand on our porch investigating a lie. He said something I've thought about often since. Panicking in front of someone with power over you just gives them a story to tell later. Staying calm gives you a record instead. I understood, finally, exactly what he'd been building toward. Word of the false police report spread through Brookstone faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. This time without Debbie controlling the framing. Neighbors who'd stayed silent for months suddenly found their voices. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small comments, quiet apologies, private messages saying they'd suspected something was wrong and hadn't known how to say it. Renee told me she'd finally reported the years-old towing incident to the county inquiry directly, providing her old receipt as evidence. The Kowalskis submitted their Venmo confirmation formally as well. Even Mrs. testify, if it came to that, about the missing board elections she'd watched Debbie quietly erase from the neighborhood's institutional memory over years. Alvarez called that weekend with real urgency in his voice for the first time. The preliminary inquiry, he said, had been upgraded internally based on the volume and consistency of new evidence. The invalid lien, the personal Venmo fines, the falsified title, and now a documented false police report corroborated by video. This isn't civil anymore, he said.
This is criminal.
I should have felt relief hearing that. Instead I felt a strange, hollow unease, remembering something Alvarez had warned us weeks earlier, that people who built their identity around control tended to escalate hardest exactly when that control started slipping for good. Debbie had just lost a public vote and a false police report in the same week. She wasn't done. Tyler's visits to his mother's house became almost daily that week, always with the laptop bag, sometimes staying well past midnight. Marcus, driving home late one evening, noticed the HOA clubhouse lights on far later than usual too. Tyler's car parked outside beside Debbie's, though the building was supposedly closed for the season for maintenance. A retired IT teacher 2 streets over, hearing rumors through the grapevine, mentioned offhand at a barbecue that Tyler had once helped him recover deleted files professionally and knew way more about erasing digital footprints than fixing them. Nobody thought much of the comment in the moment. Marcus wrote it down anyway, the way he wrote everything down now. Days later, the HOA's online document portal, the same one that had never produced meeting minutes for us, briefly went offline for scheduled maintenance, according to a notice Debbie posted. It came back up 2 days later with a suspiciously tidy new set of archived minutes dating back years, all suddenly listing Debbie as officially elected officer. Mr. Still fuming from the town hall, noticed something Debbie apparently hadn't accounted for. The newly uploaded documents used a font and formatting style that didn't exist when the original HOA website was built, years before the supposed dates on the minutes. He mentioned it to Marcus almost in passing, unaware how important that detail would become. Marcus took screenshots of the metadata immediately. Document creation dates buried in the file properties, plainly showing every historical minute had been generated within the last 2 weeks, not years ago as claimed. It was clumsy, almost desperate evidence tampering. The kind of mistake made by someone in a hurry rather than someone thinking clearly. Debbie was starting to unravel. Priya confirmed that backdating official association records to fabricate authority, especially amid an active government inquiry, could constitute an additional, more serious offense layered on top of everything else already building against her. She just handed the county a smoking gun, Priya said, sounding almost surprised by the audacity of it. People panicking rarely think clearly. That's good for us. I wanted so badly for this to be the end. For Debbie to simply be caught and quietly removed. Marcus warned me gently that people this deep into denial rarely surrendered gracefully. Cornered animals, he said. Don't calculate consequences the way calm people do. They just lash out at whatever's closest. I didn't fully understand how literally he meant that yet. The lashing out arrived 3 days later. And it wasn't aimed at Marcus this time. It was aimed at our home directly. I woke to find our front lawn covered in dozens of small metal HOA violation stakes. Spray-painted flags marking supposed infractions across every square foot, grass length, sprinkler placement, edging, even the exact position of our welcome mat. It looked less like enforcement and more like a message. Aggressive and unmistakable. The kind of display meant to humiliate rather than correct anything. Neighbors walking past slowed down. Phones raised. Several posting photos online within the hour with captions questioning whether this was normal HOA behavior anywhere. Ever. For anyone. Clearly wasn't. And everyone seemed to sense it. Marcus photographed every stake methodically before removing a single one. Cross-referencing the violations against actual bylaw sections and finding, unsurprisingly, that most cited numbers reference sections that didn't exist in the handbook at all. He filed a police report of his own this time, not for vandalism exactly, but for what looked increasingly like targeted harassment under color of authority. The responding officer, coincidentally the same younger one from the false threat call weeks earlier, recognized us immediately and took the report with visible seriousness this time, noting the pattern himself without prompting. I remember you too, he said. This is starting to look like a whole lot more than a landscaping dispute. Marcus simply nodded and thanked him. That same week, Alvarez informed us the county had issued a formal subpoena for the HOA's complete financial and governance records, no longer relying on voluntary cooperation from Debbie. The subpoena named her directly, along with the association's bank, effectively freezing her ability to quietly alter anything further without leaving an unmistakable digital trail behind for investigators to find. Debbie, apparently unaware of how thoroughly cornered she now was, tried one more public move, a mass email to the entire neighborhood accusing certain residents of colluding with outside agencies to destroy the community from within, specifically naming, for the first time, Marcus and me directly, along with Renee and the Kowalskis as co-conspirators in a smear campaign. The email backfired instantly and completely. Naming us directly, after everything already circulating, read less like righteous defense and more like the unraveling of someone who no longer had any strategy left beyond volume and accusation. Even loyalists who'd defended her at the town hall went quiet in the comments, unwilling to publicly attach themselves to that email any longer. A woman I'd never spoken with before, 3 streets over, messaged me privately that night, apologizing for staying silent for years. She said Debbie had forced her family out of an earlier dispute over a wheelchair ramp, calling it an unauthorized structure, and she'd simply moved rather than fight. She offered to submit a statement to the county inquiry immediately. Story after story started arriving that week, each one small on its own, devastating together. A disabled veteran's ramp fine, a single mother's excessive visitor, citation over her own children's father, a Filipino family's lawn ornaments singled out repeatedly while identical decorations 2 doors down went untouched for years. Debbie's pattern, once hidden, now looked undeniable in daylight. Alvarez called it, professionally, a textbook pattern of selective enforcement and unauthorized fee collection, language that sounded clinical but landed heavier than any angry accusation could have. He said the case had grown large enough that the county attorney's office was now involved directly, evaluating potential charges beyond simple civil fraud. Given the volume of victims now on record, I should have felt triumphant hearing that. Mostly I just felt exhausted. The particular exhaustion of having spent months proving something that should never have needed proving in the first place, that we belonged in our own home without earning permission from anyone, least of all someone who'd built her entire authority on a lie nobody had bothered to check. Marcus felt something closer to grim resolve than triumph too. I think, though he rarely let himself sit in any one emotion too long. "We're close," he told me one night, folder now organized into 3 thick binders on our dining table. "But people like this don't just walk away quietly. Somewhere in the next few weeks, she's going to swing as hard as she can." An unexpected detail surfaced around then, one that complicated the picture in a way I hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Almost gently, that Debbie's late husband, Frank, had actually served in the Navy himself decades earlier, stationed overseas for years while Debbie raised their children largely alone in a neighborhood that, back then, had barely tolerated her either. Frank had died young, an accident during a training exercise, leaving Debbie a widow in her 30s with 2 kids and, according to Mrs. Alvarado, the fierce, controlling grip on keeping things right that had only tightened with every year afterward. It didn't excuse anything Debbie had done. It did, uncomfortably, make her feel less like a cartoon and more like a person. I sat with that information for a long time, turning it over uneasily. How does someone who once loved a veteran, who once waited anxiously for deployment letters herself, end up weaponizing a stranger's own military service against him instead of recognizing it? Marcus, when I told him, went quiet for a while before saying only, "Grief doesn't excuse cruelty. It just explains where some of it came from." That complexity didn't slow the investigation down, and Marcus made sure it never would. Sympathy for Debbie's grief, he said gently but firmly, couldn't erase what she'd done to Renee's grandson's freedom to play outside, to the disabled veterans ramp, to the family run out over a wheelchair fence. To us, pain explains behavior sometimes. It rarely justifies it. With the county now fully engaged, Priya scheduled a meeting to prepare us for what came next. A formal hearing where the association's governance would be reviewed publicly, Debbie's authority formally challenged. And if the evidence held, which she felt confident it would, a path opened for real elections, real accountability, and potential restitution for every household she'd wrongly fined for years. The date was set for 3 weeks out, landing right in the middle of the neighborhood's annual 4th of July block party. An event Debbie had personally organized and controlled for years as her unofficial coronation each summer. Nobody planned that timing on purpose. But something about the collision felt, unmistakably, like the universe finally balancing a very old scale. Tyler showed up at his mother's house one evening looking pale, laptop bag slung stiffly over one shoulder, and this time their voices carried out through an open window, loud enough for Renee, working in her garden next door, to hear every word. "I can't keep backdating these files, Mom," he said. "This isn't a parking fine anymore. This is a subpoena." Debbie's voice, Renee said later, cracked with something between fury and desperation. "You'll do exactly what I ask. After everything I sacrificed raising you alone," she snapped. Tyler apparently left without finishing whatever he'd come to say, peeling out of the driveway faster than usual, leaving his mother alone on the porch in the fading evening light. Renee told us about it hesitantly, unsure whether it even mattered. Marcus wrote it down anyway, in the section of his binder now labeled simply cracks. He'd learned, he said, that people under this kind of pressure rarely broke evenly. Usually one person in their orbit broke first, and it was almost never the person applying the pressure. 2 nights later, our home security app pinged Marcus's phone at 2:47 a.m. with motion detected near the garage. He checked the live feed calmly, the way he checked everything, and found a figure in dark clothing crouched beside his truck, working at the door handle with something small and metallic glinting faintly under the streetlight. He woke me immediately, already pulling on shoes, phone in hand recording the live feed as he moved. I called 911 with shaking hands while he watched from the window, refusing to go outside alone and confront whoever it was directly. Not out of fear, he told me later, but because a confrontation in the dark was exactly the kind of story someone could twist against him. The figure fled before police arrived, but not before the camera captured a clear enough angle. A woman's build, a familiar golf cart parked half a block away instead of at any house nearby, and in one grainy frame as she turned, a profile Marcus recognized instantly from months of watching that same silhouette roll slowly past our curb. The responding officers reviewed the footage on our porch, this time without any of the earlier procedural distance. One of them, older, more senior than the ones we dealt with before, said flatly that attempted break-in at a private residence, especially amid an active fraud investigation naming the suspect, was a completely different category of problem than fines and rumors. Alvarez, notified the next morning, didn't hide his frustration. "She just gave us breaking and entering, or at minimum criminal trespass and attempted tampering with evidence in an active investigation," he said. "People panicking this badly usually make one mistake too many. This might be hers." My chest instead of relief. This felt less like victory and more like danger. Marcus agreed, quietly moving his binders to a fireproof lockbox at a friend's house that same day, unwilling to risk the case's foundation sitting vulnerable in our garage a moment longer. "She's not thinking clearly anymore," he said. "People who aren't thinking clearly do reckless things." We protect the evidence first. We worry about her next move second. Debbie, confronted by an officer the following afternoon regarding the break-in, denied everything, claiming she'd simply been out for a late walk near our street, unaware her golf carts, built-in GPS, a feature she'd once bragged about at a neighborhood meeting for safety tracking purposes, logged her parked half a block from our garage for 11 full minutes that night. The county attorney's office, Alvarez told us, was now treating the case with real urgency, adding attempted evidence tampering and possible criminal trespass to the growing list under review. He warned us again, more seriously this time, that Debbie's behavior suggested someone who felt she had nothing left to lose. Be careful the next few weeks, he said. Genuinely careful. I started sleeping poorly again, jumping at every passing car, every golf cart hum in the distance. Marcus noticed and, without making a show of it, began parking his truck differently, varying our routine slightly. Small precautions that felt paranoid until I remembered someone had actually tried to break into our garage 3 nights earlier. Paranoia, apparently, had become simple realism. The 4th of July block party loomed closer, and rumors swirled that Debbie planned something for it. Nobody knew exactly what, only that she'd been overheard at the clubhouse insisting the annual event absolutely could not be canceled or moved, despite the hearing scheduled just days after it. Marcus suspected she wanted one last public stage before losing control entirely. We debated skipping the block party altogether. Tired of being spectacle. Tired of feeling watched in our own neighborhood. Priya advised against skipping it. Absence reads as guilt to people who don't know the full story yet, she said. Show up. Stay calm. Let her be the one who makes a scene in public this time. She usually does. The morning of the block party arrived humid and bright. Flags strung between lampposts. A bounce house inflating in the common area. The smell of grilled corn drifting down the street like nothing had ever gone wrong here at all. I almost let myself enjoy it. Right up until I saw Debbie setting up a folding table directly in front of our usual spot. On the table sat a stack of flyers, a small portable speaker, and, unmistakably, chillingly, a printed banner reading, Protect Brookstone. Know your neighbors. Beside blown-up photos of our house circled in red marker. Timestamps from the false police call weeks earlier printed underneath like evidence in a trial only she believed she was winning. Marcus's jaw tightened for the first time in weeks, watching her hammer a small sign into the ground beside her table. Our address printed on it in bold letters beneath the word, concern. Neighbors slowed as they passed. Uncomfortable, some quickly steering children away from the display. Others lingering just long enough to read every word twice. I wanted to walk straight over and rip the banner down. Marcus caught my arm gently, not stopping me exactly, just steadying me. Let people see it, he said quietly. Every person who reads that today is a witness we didn't have to convince ourselves. It took everything in me to nod and keep walking instead of confronting her directly. By early afternoon, Debbie had drawn a small crowd around her folding table, some genuinely alarmed by her framing, others visibly uncomfortable with the spectacle itself. She used the portable speaker to announce, loudly enough for half the block to hear, that certain households had been under active investigation for endangering community safety, twisting the truth completely inside out for her audience. Alvarez, who'd quietly attended in plain clothes at our invitation, stepped forward at that point, close enough for Debbie to recognize his county badge from earlier visits. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, publicly, calm and clear, whether she'd like to clarify which investigation she meant, given that the county's actual active inquiry currently named her. Not us. The color drained from Debbie's face in front of nearly 40 neighbors. Kids on a bounce house pausing mid-jump at the sudden hush spreading across the block party. She sputtered something about misinformation and harassment, but her voice had lost the practiced authority it always carried before. For the first time since we'd met her, Debbie Sinclair looked genuinely afraid. She grabbed her banner and folding table hurriedly, nearly knocking over a tray of deviled eggs in her rush, muttering something about people twisting her words as she retreated toward her golf cart. Nobody moved to stop her. Nobody needed to. Watched. In broad daylight, the exact moment her carefully built authority finally, publicly, began to collapse. I expected relief to hit me the moment she drove off. Instead, I felt strangely hollow, the way you feel after holding your breath so long that finally exhaling doesn't bring the comfort you expected. Marcus squeezed my hand and said only, "She's not done. People like this don't fold from embarrassment. They fold from losing everything. And she hasn't lost that yet." He was right within 48 hours. A patrol car pulled into our driveway 2 mornings later. But this time the tone was entirely different. An officer explained, almost apologetically, that a 911 call had come in reporting an armed disturbance at our address. Caller describing a man matching Marcus's description, acting erratically with a weapon in our backyard. My blood ran cold. But doing nothing more dangerous than trimming the hedge with garden shears. Exactly the kind of ordinary weekend task he did every month. The dispatcher's description, twisted just enough to sound like a genuine threat, had triggered a response protocol that brought 3 patrol cars, not one, rolling up within minutes. I watched from the front window, heart pounding, as officers approached cautiously, hands near their holsters, shouting instructions for Marcus to show his hands and step away from whatever he was holding. He complied immediately, slowly, deliberately, the shears dropping to the grass, his hands raised high and steady, years of training visible in every controlled, unhurried movement he made. Those seconds stretched longer than any in my life. Watching my husband stand perfectly still in our own backyard while armed officers assessed whether he was a threat. All because someone had picked up a phone and decided the truth wasn't dramatic enough. An officer finally lowered his weapon, confirming the garden shears, confirming Marcus's ID, confirming, again, that nothing here was ever real. The senior officer, visibly furious once the situation resolved safely, pulled out his notepad and asked pointed questions about who might have made a call describing an ordinary man trimming hedges as an armed threat. Marcus, hands still slightly unsteady despite his outward calm, mentioned Debbie's name without hesitation. 2 neighbors, unprompted, independently mentioned seeing her golf cart nearby minutes before the call. I sat on our porch steps afterward, shaking in a way I hadn't since the very beginning of all this, understanding with sudden clarity exactly how dangerous a lie like that could have become. A different day, a different officer, a different split second of misjudgment, and this story could have ended in tragedy instead of relief. Debbie hadn't just harassed us. She had endangered Marcus's life. Alvarez arrived within the hour, and for the first time since we'd met him, his professional composure slipped into something closer to open anger. "Filing a false armed disturbance report is a felony in this state," he said. "That's not a fine anymore. That's not even fraud anymore. That's attempted use of law enforcement as a weapon against another person's life." The county attorney's office, informed immediately, moved with unusual speed once armed officers had been dispatched under false pretenses. A warrant was issued that same evening for Debbie's arrest on charges, including filing a false police report, criminal trespass, and, pending further review, fraud related to the fabricated HOA records and unauthorized fee collection spanning years of documented harm. I should have felt triumphant watching 2 patrol cars pull into Debbie's driveway that night, red and blue lights washing silently over the same manicured lawn she'd policed so ruthlessly for years. Instead, I mostly felt tired, and sad in a way I hadn't expected, watching a woman who'd terrorized us finally led out of her own home in handcuffs, blinds twitching up and down the street. Tyler stood in the driveway as his mother was placed in the back of the patrol car, laptop bag hanging forgotten at his side, tears streaking down a face that looked, for the first time since any of this began, genuinely young and lost rather than complicit. He didn't try to stop the officers. He didn't defend her. Silent, watching. 2 days later, Tyler reached out to Marcus directly, asking to meet somewhere neutral, away from Brookstone entirely. He arrived at the coffee shop looking like he hadn't slept, sliding a flash drive across the table before either of us had even ordered anything. "Everything's on there," he said quietly. "Every file I helped her backdate. Every deleted email I recovered instead of destroyed," he explained, voice cracking occasionally, that he'd started helping his mother out of guilt after his father's death, watching her spiral into control as the only thing that made her feel steady again. He'd told himself for years it was harmless enforcement, parking tickets and mulch complaints. The false armed disturbance call, he said, was the moment he finally understood how far it had gone. I felt an unexpected wave of something almost like sympathy watching him. This young man caught between loyalty to a grieving mother and the slow realization that grief didn't excuse what she'd built. Marcus thanked him plainly, without judgment, and told him the flash drive would matter enormously, both for the case and, eventually, for however Tyler chose to live with all of this. The flash drive, once reviewed by Alvarez's team, turned out to contain exactly what Tyler promised: years of backdated meeting minutes, deleted resident complaints against Debbie herself, a spreadsheet tracking personal Venmo payments totaling over $11,000 collected under false HOA authority, and internal notes referencing problem households that read, unmistakably, like a target list sorted by race and background. Seeing that list in writing, our address flagged early, alongside notes about unfamiliar family dynamics and verify ownership claims, language used for almost no other household on the street, confirmed something I'd suspected for months but never had proof of. This had never simply been about mulch depth or parking spots. It had always, quietly, been about exactly who Debbie decided deserved to belong. Priya said the spreadsheet alone likely guaranteed a much stronger case than even the false police reports could, because it demonstrated clear, documented intent rather than isolated incidents that could be dismissed as misunderstandings. Juries forgive confusion, she said. They don't forgive a list. I read that sentence 3 times before I finally let myself believe this might really be almost over. Debbie posted bail within 48 hours. Returning to a house now surrounded by silence instead of banana bread and admiring neighbors. The golf cart sat unused in her driveway for the first time in years. Nobody waved. The very authority she'd spent years constructing evaporated the moment enough people finally saw the full shape of what she'd actually been doing. The neighborhood group, once her personal broadcasting platform, filled instead with quiet apologies from residents who'd stayed silent too long, some admitting they'd suspected something wrong for years and simply hadn't wanted the confrontation. I read every message this time without anger, mostly just exhausted relief that the truth, however delayed, had finally become impossible for anyone to keep ignoring. With the hearing now just days away, Priya confirmed the county was prepared to present the full case publicly. The invalid title, the personal Venmo scheme, the falsified records, the false police reports, and now Tyler's flash drive laying bare years of deliberate, documented targeting. This won't just resolve your fines, she told us. This will likely end her role in this community permanently. Marcus closed his binder that night for what felt like the first time in months without immediately reopening it to add something new. He looked, for just a moment, like a man finally allowed to exhale after holding a defensive posture far too long. "We didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "We just refused to disappear quietly." The days before the hearing passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the kind that comes after a long fight when your body still braces for impact out of habit even after the danger has technically passed. I found myself checking the driveway less often, sleeping slightly longer, though the tightness in my chest never fully released until we walked into that hearing room. Renee organized something none of us expected. A small dinner the night before the hearing, inviting every household willing to testify, turning what could have been a night of anxious waiting into something closer to quiet solidarity. The Kowalskis brought a casserole. Mrs. her decades-old copy of the original bylaws, dog-eared and heavily highlighted, like a soldier bringing her own weapon. Mr. hosted the table with sparkling cider, saying simply that Brookstone Estates had let itself be run by fear for far too long, and that whatever happened tomorrow, at least people had finally stopped being afraid to say so out loud together. I looked around that table, neighbors who'd been strangers 8 months earlier, and felt something unexpectedly close to gratitude. Debbie's lawyer reached out to Priya 2 days before the hearing, testing the waters for a plea arrangement that would keep things quiet, minimal admission of wrongdoing, restitution paid privately rather than through public record. Priya relayed it to us flatly. "Your call entirely," she said. "But given everything Tyler handed over, I don't think she has much leverage left to negotiate with." Marcus and I talked about it late into the night, weighing quiet resolution against public accountability. In the end, it wasn't really a hard decision. Too many other families had been quietly harmed and quietly silenced already. A private settlement would protect Debbie's reputation far more than it would protect anyone she'd actually hurt. We told Priya to proceed with the public hearing. Word of the hearing spread further than we expected. A local news reporter reaching out after hearing about the case through county filings, asking if we'd be willing to speak briefly afterward. Marcus hesitated, uncomfortable with attention for its own sake, but agreed it might help other households elsewhere recognize similar patterns before they escalated as far as ours had. I spent the morning of the hearing rereading the folder, now 3 organized binders, one final time, not out of doubt, but out of something closer to reverence for how much quiet, methodical work had gone into surviving something designed to make us feel powerless. Every certified letter, every screenshot, every timestamp had been Marcus's way of refusing to disappear. We dressed carefully that morning, not for fashion, but for the simple dignity of showing up exactly as ourselves. No armor needed beyond the truth we'd spent months documenting. Marcus wore, for the first time publicly since we'd moved to Brookstone, a small pin from his old command. Understated, easy to miss unless you knew exactly what it represented. The county building's hearing room felt smaller and more ordinary than I'd imagined for something that had consumed nearly a year of our lives. Plain chairs, fluorescent lighting, a long table at the front where a review panel would sit. Somehow the mundanity of the space made the moment feel more real, not less, like justice didn't need theater to matter. Renee, the Kowalskis, Mrs. Alvarado, and half a dozen other residents filled the rows behind us. A quiet wall of support neither Marcus nor I had expected when this all started with a ceramic rooster and a clipboard. I turned once to look at them before the panel entered and felt, finally, unmistakably, like we weren't standing alone anymore. Debbie arrived with her attorney a few minutes later, noticeably thinner than I remembered, the confident posture gone, replaced by something smaller and more brittle. Tyler wasn't with her. I didn't know yet whether that absence was punishment, protection, or simply grief finally catching up to a family that had built itself around control instead of honesty for far too long. The panel chair opened by outlining the scope of the hearing, review of the association's governance failures, the validity of fines and liens issued under Debbie's unauthorized title, and referral recommendations to the county attorney's office regarding the criminal matters already in progress separately. It sounded clinical, procedural, nothing like the year of fear it had taken to arrive at this room. Priya presented first, methodical and unhurried, walking the panel through the timeline exactly as Marcus had built it, dates, documents, screenshots, financial records, never raising her voice, never needing to, because the sheer volume of consistent, corroborated evidence did more work than outrage ever could have. I watched several panel members' expressions shift from neutral to visibly troubled within minutes. When Priya reached the false arm disturbance call, the room went completely silent, the kind of silence that has actual weight to it. She played the 911 audio, Debbie's voice unmistakable despite the attempted disguise, describing a man calmly trimming hedges as erratic and armed. Even Debbie's own attorney, I noticed, stopped taking notes for a moment. Debbie's attorney tried, briefly, to frame the incident as a genuine misunderstanding born of neighborhood safety concerns. But the panel chair cut in almost immediately, asking dryly whether garden shears typically qualified as an armed threat justifying 3 patrol cars. The attempted defense collapsed under its own absurdity before it had even fully finished forming in the room. One by one, the residents behind us spoke, briefly, plainly, without embellishment. Renee's towed car, the Kowalskis' Venmo fine, Mrs. Alvarado's missing elections, a mother describing her child's freedom to play outside quietly curtailed by implication rather than rule. Each story alone might have sounded like a misunderstanding. Together, read aloud in that room, they sounded exactly like what they were. I hadn't planned to speak, thinking Marcus's careful documentation had already said everything that needed saying. But when the panel asked if I wanted to add anything, I found myself standing anyway, voice steadier than I expected, describing simply what it felt like to stand in my own driveway, groceries melting, explaining to police officers that I belonged in my own home. I didn't editorialize or perform emotion I didn't feel. I just told the truth plainly, the way Marcus had taught me to over the past year without ever quite saying so out loud. Dates, details, exact words spoken, exact consequences that followed. When I sat back down, Marcus squeezed my hand once, and I understood, finally, that I hadn't needed armor either. Marcus spoke last, and for the first time in the entire process, he mentioned his service directly, not as a shield, not as proof of worthiness, but simply as context for why he'd instinctively documented everything so carefully from the beginning. I've seen what happens when people in positions of unchecked authority go unquestioned, he said. I wasn't going to let that happen quietly here, he described, without visible anger. The parking lot confrontation, the tire slashing, the invalid lien, the break-in attempt, the armed disturbance call, laying each incident down like evidence pieces on a table rather than grievances. The panel chair, listening closely, finally asked the question that had clearly been building throughout the entire hearing. How had this gone unchecked for so many years? Mrs. answered before anyone else could, standing slowly with her highlighted bylaws still in hand. Because good people got tired of fighting her, one small unfair thing at a time, until it just felt easier to stay quiet, she said. Until finally 2 people moved in who refused to stay quiet, and the rest of us remembered we didn't have to either. The panel called a brief recess before deliberation, and the hearing room emptied into the hallway in tense, quiet clusters. Debbie sat alone on a bench near the far wall, her attorney conferring quietly with someone on the phone, no neighbors nearby offering support the way ours had all morning. I felt, watching her there, less satisfaction than I expected and more simple exhaustion. Marcus found me staring and gently steered my attention away. Don't spend your energy on her right now, he said. Save it for whatever comes after this room. I nodded, though some part of me couldn't stop noticing how small she looked without a clipboard, without a golf cart, without a neighborhood full of people too afraid to question her. When the panel returned, the chair read their preliminary findings aloud. Careful and deliberate. Sufficient evidence to invalidate Debbie's self-appointed title retroactively. Sufficient evidence to void every fine, fee, and lien issued under her unauthorized authority across multiple years, and formal referral of all criminal matters to the county attorney's office for prosecution. Given the volume of documented harm, the room exhaled audibly, a collective release of breath held far longer than anyone realized until it finally let go. Renee grabbed my hand. Mrs. Her eyes without embarrassment. Marcus simply sat very still beside me, absorbing the outcome quietly the way he absorbed most things. Though I felt his hand tighten briefly around mine at the words, void every fine. The panel also announced an immediate emergency election, scheduled within 30 days, to establish a legitimate, properly documented board for the first time in years. Mrs. Alvarado, unprompted, nominated Marcus on the spot, citing his methodical oversight and calm handling of an impossible situation as exactly the leadership the neighborhood had gone without for far too long. Marcus looked genuinely startled by the nomination, glancing at me before answering. I just smiled and nodded slightly, knowing already what he'd decide. I'll serve if the neighborhood actually wants transparent, accountable governance, he said carefully. Not to replace one person's control with another's. To make sure no single person ever holds this kind of unchecked power here again. Outside the hearing room, the local reporter who'd reached out earlier caught us briefly on the courthouse steps, asking a few careful questions. Marcus kept his answers measured and factual, refusing to turn our year of fear into spectacle for its own sake. We just wanted to live in our own home without needing anyone's permission, he said simply. Now other families might not have to fight for that. Debbie left the courthouse separately, quickly, her attorney shielding her from the small cluster of reporters gathering outside once word had spread. I watched her go without feeling the surge of vindication I'd once imagined I would. Mostly I just felt tired and hopeful, in the particular way that comes after finally setting down something heavy you'd carried far longer than you should have had to. That evening, back home, Marcus and I sat on our porch steps in the quiet. No golf cart rolling past. No flyers taped anywhere. Just ordinary summer air and the sound of kids playing 2 houses down. It's not fully over yet, he said, watching the sky turn orange. But for the first time since we moved here, it finally feels like ours. The criminal trial began 6 weeks later, delayed slightly while prosecutors built out the full financial picture from Tyler's flash drive and subpoenaed bank records. What started as a handful of confirmed Venmo payments grew, under forensic accounting, into something far larger than any of us had imagined sitting at our kitchen table months earlier piecing together scattered finds. Investigators traced over $81,000 in HOA funds diverted through fake vendor contracts, personal payment apps, and inflated landscaping invoices spanning nearly 9 years, not months, not one bad season. Nearly a decade of quiet theft dressed up as diligent community management. I read the number in the prosecutor's summary 3 times before it fully registered. A forensic accountant testified that a significant portion of the diverted funds coincided suspiciously with tuition payments to Tyler's out-of-state university years earlier,
followed later by payments matching a series of gambling losses documented through a separate financial trail investigators uncovered almost by accident while tracing an unrelated account discrepancy. Debbie's motives, turned out, were far less abstract than control.
Sitting in the gallery hearing that testimony, I felt something complicated shift in me, not quite sympathy, never that, but a clearer, uglier understanding of what had actually been driving her all along. The rules, the fines, the surveillance, the false reports, all of it had, at least partly, functioned as camouflage for a much older, much simpler theft she'd been hiding for years. Marcus reached that conclusion before I did, quieter and more clinical about it. People who steal quietly need everyone distracted and afraid to look too closely, he said one evening, reviewing the accountant's report. Fear is easier to maintain than honesty. She built an entire system to keep people looking at parking spots instead of bank statements. It made a terrible kind of sense. A week before opening statements, Debbie showed up unannounced at our front door. No golf cart this time. Just her own car parked crookedly at the curb. her composure completely gone. I nearly didn't recognize her at first. Hair unkempt, eyes red, hands trembling as she asked, almost pleading, if we would reconsider testifying against her at trial. Marcus stepped slightly in front of me, calm but immovable, and told her plainly that the decision was no longer ours to reconsider. The case belonged to the state now, not to us personally. Debbie's face crumpled, then hardened just as quickly, old defensiveness flashing through the exhaustion. You people ruined my life over parking tickets, she said bitterly, voice cracking. I felt something in me finally snap loose after months of careful restraint. You called armed police on a man trimming hedges, I said, my own voice shaking but steady. You slashed tires. You broke into our garage. You built a lie so big it took a courtroom to unravel it. We didn't ruin anything, Debbie. You did. A long time before we ever moved. She didn't respond right away. Just stood there on our porch step. The same porch where she'd once demanded we remove a ceramic rooster, looking suddenly smaller than the woman who'd terrorized an entire neighborhood for years. I just wanted things to stay right, she finally said, quietly, almost to herself. I just wanted to keep everything under control. Marcus asked her to leave. She did. I stood in the doorway watching her drive away unsteadily, feeling drained rather than triumphant. The strange emotional hangover of finally hearing someone admit, however incompletely, the fear underneath years of cruelty. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't undo a single sleepless night. But it gave the whole ugly story a shape that finally made a kind of exhausted, human sense. Priya, informed of the visit, filed it immediately as a potential witness intimidation concern, adding it to the growing file the prosecution would use to argue against any leniency in sentencing. Showing up at a victim's home before trial rarely goes well for a defendant, she said flatly. She just made her own case harder. Again, exactly like every other panic move she's made. Jury selection took 2 days. Longer than expected given local media coverage of the case by then. Several potential jurors admitting they'd already read about the HOA fraud lady online. The judge dismissed anyone with strong pre-existing opinions, eventually seating 12 residents from across the county who'd never heard of Brookstone Estates or the woman who'd once ruled it from a folding table. Opening statements began on a Tuesday morning, the prosecutor laying out the case methodically, years of self-appointed authority, unauthorized fee collection, falsified records, a false armed disturbance call that nearly ended in tragedy, and, underneath all of it, a pattern of theft disguised as diligence. Debbie sat beside her attorney, pale, still, staring at the table rather than the jury. Marcus testified first among the witnesses, walking the jury through his binders with the same unhurried precision he'd shown from the very beginning: dates, documents, timestamps, video footage, never once raising his voice, never needing to. I watched several jurors lean forward as he described calmly finding a stranger crouched by his truck door at nearly 3 in the morning. The defense attorney's cross-examination tried, carefully, to paint Marcus as overly suspicious from the start. Someone who'd built a case against an innocent volunteer rather than simply documenting harassment. Marcus answered every question evenly, without defensiveness, pointing out patiently that documentation only becomes a case when the underlying behavior gives it something true to document. I testified next, describing the grocery bag afternoon in careful, unembellished detail, the melting milk, the 2 patrol cars, the crowd of neighbors watching from their porches while I stood in my own driveway proving I belonged there. The prosecutor asked how that moment had made me feel. I said, simply, invisible in the one place I'd expected to finally feel seen. Renee testified about her towed car and the years-old fear that had kept her silent afterward, describing the private message Debbie had sent warning her fence variance was still under review, the moment she dared to publicly defend me. The Kowalskis testified about the Venmo fine, producing the same tax records that had first cracked the case open at our kitchen table months earlier. Mrs. Sharp and unshaken at 81 years old, testified about the missing board elections, holding up the same yellowed printout she'd first shown us at our mailbox, describing how easily a community's institutional memory could be quietly erased by someone patient enough and unquestioned long enough to simply rewrite it as she went. The mother who'd once lost custody-adjacent visitation piece over a fabricated, excessive visitor fine testified too, voice-breaking as she described choosing, for months, to keep her children's father away rather than risk another confrontation. Watching her cry on the stand, I felt the full, cumulative weight of everything Debbie's small cruelties had cost people who'd never had a Marcus to fight back with. The forensic accountant walked the jury through 9 years of financial records methodically, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, showing exactly how HOA dues meant for shared landscaping, insurance, and reserve funds had instead flowed quietly into personal accounts, gambling platforms, and a university bursar's office 3 states away, disguised the entire time behind invoices for services barely, sometimes never, actually performed. Tyler's written statement, read into the record since he declined to testify in person, described in raw, unfiltered language how his own guilt over his father's death had made him complicit in helping his mother keep control of something, anything, long after he'd realized what she was really doing wasn't protection anymore, but theft dressed carefully in official-sounding language. The defense's final witness, a longtime loyalist neighbor, tried to characterize Debbie as a devoted, if occasionally overzealous, community volunteer who'd simply cared too much. The prosecutor's cross-examination dismantled that framing within minutes, asking whether caring too much typically involved a personal Venmo account, forged meeting minutes, and a false report describing garden shears as a firearm. By the time closing arguments began, the courtroom's mood had shifted entirely from curiosity to something closer to quiet, collective disbelief that one person's carefully maintained illusion had gone unquestioned for so long, in a neighborhood full of otherwise reasonable, decent people simply too tired, too polite, or too afraid to ask the one question that finally unraveled everything. Who actually gave you this authority? The prosecutor's closing argument returned to that exact question repeatedly, hammering it like a refrain, not who Debbie claimed to be, but who had actually elected her, actually authorized her, actually given her the power she'd wielded like a weapon for nearly a decade. The honest answer, repeated for the jury one final time, was simple. Nobody ever had. Debbie's attorney argued for leniency in his closing, painting a portrait of a grieving widow who'd lost herself slowly inside misguided control after her husband's death, someone who deserved treatment and understanding rather than harsh punishment. It was, in its own way, not entirely untrue. It also, unmistakably, wasn't the whole truth either, and everyone in that room seemed to sense the difference. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. Less time than any of us expected given the volume of evidence they'd sat through. Waiting outside the courtroom, Marcus held my hand tightly, both of us silent. Neither of us quite able to fully believe we were sitting this close to an actual ending after nearly a year of feeling like the story might never stop. When the bailiff finally called us back inside, the room felt different, charged. Everyone straightening in their seats as the jury foreperson stood holding a folded piece of paper that somehow carried the weight of everything that had happened since a ceramic rooster first sat innocently on our front steps almost a year earlier. Guilty. Guilty. On the false police report charges. Guilty. On the criminal trespass related to the garage break-in. The words landed one after another, steady and final, and I felt Marcus's hand tighten around mine with each one. Not in triumph exactly, but in something closer to relief so heavy it nearly buckled my knees to hear it confirmed aloud. Debbie sat motionless as the verdicts were read, staring straight ahead. No visible reaction beyond a single slow exhale that seemed to deflate something in her posture permanently. Her attorney placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. She didn't turn toward it. Finally, unmistakably, exactly as powerless as every household she'd once controlled from a clubhouse folding table. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered again. More of them this time given the guilty verdicts, asking for comment. Marcus kept his statement brief, careful, unwilling to turn a hard one ending into a victory lap at someone else's expense. This was never about revenge, he said.
It was about making sure no one else has to spend.
I added only a little to that, my voice steadier than I expected standing in front of cameras for the first time in my life. If something like this is happening to you, I said, document everything, and don't stay quiet just because it feels smaller than it is at first. Ours started with a garden gnome. It almost ended with a felony. A few reporters actually laughed. Gently, sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving the court time to review restitution calculations for every household affected, a process that, once fully tallied, revealed the scope of harm even we hadn't fully grasped, spanning residents who'd moved away years earlier, families who'd never spoken publicly, elderly homeowners quietly overcharged for maintenance fees that never funded actual maintenance. In the weeks between verdict and sentencing, the neighborhood held its long-promised emergency election, properly documented this time, ballots collected by an independent county monitor rather than a single self-appointed authority. Marcus ran unopposed for board president, though he insisted, repeatedly, that the position exist alongside real term limits and transparent financial reporting this time, not personality-driven control. I stood beside him at the small clubhouse gathering where results were announced, watching neighbors who'd once whispered nervously about Debbie's list applaud openly instead. No fear left in the room at all. Renee cried a little. Mrs. us both fiercely, saying only that Brookstone Estates finally felt like a neighborhood again instead of a kingdom. Marcus's first act as president wasn't punitive or dramatic. He simply published, publicly and permanently, every governing document the community had ever lacked access to, real bylaws, real meeting minutes, a real auditable budget anyone could review anytime they wanted. Sunlight, he said at that first open meeting, is the only rule this neighborhood actually needed all along. Sentencing day arrived on a gray, unremarkable morning. Nothing cinematic about it despite everything that had led there. The courtroom filled again with familiar faces. Renee, the Kowalskis, Mrs. Alvarado, the mother who'd testified about her children. Dozens of quietly affected residents who'd finally found their voices somewhere across the long, exhausting year behind us. The judge reviewed the full scope before pronouncing sentence. Nearly a decade of theft. A pattern of selective, race-tinged enforcement documented extensively through testimony and records. And, gravest of all, a false report that had summoned armed officers to a scene of genuine, needless danger. This wasn't overzealous volunteering, the judge said plainly. This was a sustained abuse of trust and authority. Debbie was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, with an additional period of supervised probation following release, alongside a restitution order covering the full $81,000 in diverted HOA funds, to be repaid through whatever assets remained once her home, the same home from which she'd once policed an entire street, was formally sold to satisfy the judgment. I watched her led out of the courtroom in handcuffs a second time. This time permanently. No bail. No golf cart waiting outside. No clubhouse folding table to retreat behind. She didn't look back at any of us. I found, watching her disappear through that side door, that I felt almost nothing at all. Not hatred. Not triumph. Just a quiet, settled kind of closure. Tyler wasn't in the courtroom that day. Though Priya mentioned he'd since moved out of state. Enrolled voluntarily in a fraud awareness diversion program the prosecution had recommended given his cooperation. Rebuilding something quieter and more honest than the life he'd spent years helping his mother maintain by force. I hoped, genuinely, that he found it eventually, outside the courthouse for the final time. Marcus and I stood together on the same steps where this entire public chapter had first spilled into daylight months earlier. He looked at me and said something simple, almost surprised by his own relief. "We can just be a regular family in a regular neighborhood now," he said. I honestly forgot what that felt like. I laughed. The first real, unguarded laugh I'd allowed myself in what felt like a very long time, and told him regular sounded, honestly, like the most extraordinary thing either of us could ask for after everything. We drove home that afternoon without a single fine waiting on our door, without a golf cart trailing us down the street, without anyone watching at all. That evening, our street looked exactly the way it had the very first day we moved in. Matching mailboxes, trimmed hedges, ordinary summer light settling gold across ordinary rooftops. Except now it felt different, lighter, genuinely ours in a way no clipboard or false title had ever been able to take from us, no matter how hard someone had once tried. In the weeks following sentencing, our story spread further than Brookstone Estates ever could have on its own. Picked up first by a regional outlet, then shared widely enough that strangers from HOAs across 3 different states began reaching out to Marcus directly, describing eerily similar patterns, self-appointed officers, unexplained fees, fines that never quite matched the actual bylaws. Marcus started, almost accidentally, compiling a simple public guide based on everything he'd learned the hard way: how to legally request board election records, how to identify unauthorized fee collection, how to document harassment methodically enough for it to matter later. It wasn't a business, he insisted, just information nobody should have had to learn the way we did. Priya reached out one afternoon to share an unexpected update. 2 other households, inspired by news coverage of our case, had successfully challenged fraudulent HOA officers in neighboring counties using nearly identical documentation strategies. "You didn't just fix your own neighborhood," she said. "You handed other people a map for fixing theirs too." I hadn't thought of it that way until she said it aloud. Restitution checks began arriving slowly, modest at first given the property sale still pending, but meaningful nonetheless. The Kowalskis received their old Venmo fine back with something close to disbelief. Renee finally recovering the towing fees she'd quietly absorbed years earlier without ever expecting repayment. Small amounts, individually, collectively, a long overdue acknowledgement that the harm had been real. Debbie's house went up for sale that autumn. A modest for sale sign replacing the golf cart that used to sit proudly in her driveway. Watching moving trucks empty out the same house where she'd once hosted casual, admiring neighbors over banana bread felt less satisfying than I expected and more simply, quietly final. Another ordinary ending to an extraordinary abuse of trust. A young family moved in eventually, unaware at first of the house's history, until a well-meaning neighbor gently filled them in over a welcome basket. No ceramic roosters this time, just genuine warmth extended without any hidden agenda attached. I watched their kids ride bikes past our house one afternoon and felt something unexpectedly tender about the quiet, ordinary rightness of that image. The mother who'd testified about her children reached out to me privately months later, thanking me for something I hadn't fully realized I'd given her. Permission to finally speak the truth about what she'd endured without fear of consequence. We met for coffee twice after that. An unexpected friendship built from shared, difficult history neither of us had chosen but both of us had survived. Mrs. Now serving as the HOA's official records keeper under the new bylaws Marcus had helped draft, took visible pride in maintaining meticulous, publicly accessible minutes for every single meeting, joking often that she intended to outlive at least 3 more board presidents just to make sure nobody ever tried what Debbie had gotten away with for so long again. I found myself, slowly, rebuilding a version of trust in our neighborhood I hadn't realized I'd lost until it started returning. Small waves at the mailbox that felt genuine rather than performative. Invitations to dinners that had nothing to do with proving loyalty to anyone. The simple, ordinary rhythm of belonging somewhere without needing to constantly justify that belonging to a single controlling gatekeeper. Marcus's board presidency. A year in, focused almost entirely on things Debbie had never once prioritized. Fixing the actual pool filtration system, repaving genuinely cracked sidewalks, funding a community scholarship using leftover reserve funds instead of hoarding vague compliance fees nobody could ever quite explain. Brookstone Estates started looking, slowly, like the neighborhood its original brochure had always promised. Renee's grandson, once quietly warned away from the common area after dark, played there openly most evenings now, laughter carrying across the street in a way that felt, to me, like one of the clearest measures of how much had genuinely changed. Nobody watched him with narrowed eyes from a golf cart anymore. Nobody needed to. Plainly, the way he always should have. I thought often, during that first easier year, about how close we'd come to simply paying every unfair fine quietly and moving on, the way so many households before us apparently had. It would have been easier in the short term. It also would have meant Debbie kept going, unchecked, for however many more years until someone else finally ran out of patience. Marcus, when I said something similar to him one evening, shook his head slightly. It was never really about patience, he said. It was about documentation. Anger burns out. I laughed at how thoroughly that sentence summarized 9 months of our lives. But I also understood, by then, exactly how true it was. Every certified letter, every screenshot, every timestamp had mattered. The local news outlet that first covered our story ran a follow-up piece nearly a year later, checking in on Brookstone Estate's transformation under new leadership, interviewing several residents who'd once been too afraid to speak publicly at all. Watching Renee describe, on camera, finally feeling safe enough to let her grandson play outside again. I felt something in my chest ease completely. Tyler sent Marcus a short, unexpected letter that same year, from wherever he'd relocated to rebuild his own life, thanking him for treating him like a person capable of change rather than simply an extension of his mother's crimes. Marcus wrote back once, brief and kind, wishing him well without pretending the past hadn't happened. Some doors, I've learned, close gently instead of slamming. I still keep, tucked in a drawer, the very first violation notice Debbie ever left us, the ceramic rooster citation, $45, our very first proof that something in this neighborhood wasn't right. I take it out occasionally, not out of bitterness anymore, but as a small, strange reminder of how something so minor once nearly cost us so much. Marcus keeps his own memento too, framed now instead of filed away, the printed HOA officer roster misses. Alvarado first handed us at the mailbox, the one that finally proved, in black and white, exactly what everyone had suspected but no one had dared confirm out loud for years. Paperwork, he says whenever I ask why he framed something so ordinary. It's the only thing that never lies. Priya visited once, months after the case had fully closed, just to see how we were settling into ordinary life again. She admitted, over coffee at our kitchen table, that our case had become something of a teaching example at her clinic now, cited whenever new attorneys needed to understand exactly how much damage unchecked, small authority could quietly do over enough uncontested years. I asked her, half joking, whether she thought Debbie could have been stopped years earlier, before any of it reached us. She considered the question seriously before answering. Someone probably could have, she said. But it usually takes one household willing to document everything instead of just enduring it. You two just happen to be exactly that household, whether you wanted to be or not. That framing stuck with me longer than I expected. We hadn't set out to be anyone's rescue story. We'd simply refused, slowly and methodically, to disappear quietly the way so many households before us apparently had. Somewhere along the way, that refusal had become something larger than our own driveway, our own fence line, our own small, stubborn insistence on belonging. Marcus's term as board president eventually ended, term limits doing exactly what they were designed to do, and a new, equally ordinary resident took over with the same transparent bylaws now permanently in place. He stepped down without ceremony, the way he did most things, quietly satisfied that the system itself, not any one person, would keep the neighborhood accountable going forward. I sometimes catch myself standing on our porch in the evenings, the same porch where a ceramic rooster once sparked a year of quiet warfare, watching kids ride bikes past matching mailboxes under ordinary golden light, and feeling something I didn't expect to feel again after everything. Simple, uncomplicated peace. The exact thing Brookstone Estates' glossy brochure had promised us from the very beginning. Debbie remains, as far as any of us know, still serving her sentence. Her house long since sold. Her name occasionally surfacing in county records whenever another affected resident from years past files a late restitution claim. I don't think about her often anymore, though I imagine she still thinks about us, about the family she assumed would simply endure quietly, and didn't. I've come to understand, looking back over everything, that what saved us wasn't anger, and it wasn't even entirely justice, though both mattered. What saved us was Marcus's stubborn, patient insistence on turning fear into documentation. One certified letter, one time-stamped photo, one calm, unhurried folder at a time, until the truth simply became too large and too well organized for anyone to keep denying. I think, too, about every household who came forward once they finally felt safe enough. Renee, the Kowalskis, Mrs. Alvarado, the mother who'd once silenced herself out of fear, and how none of this would have unraveled without their courage stacking quietly on top of ours. Justice, I learned, rarely arrives through one person's fight alone. It arrives through everyone finally refusing together. Marcus still keeps a folder, out of habit more than necessity now, though these days it holds nothing more dramatic than genuine HOA meeting minutes and a transparent annual budget anyone can request freely. Some evenings I catch him flipping through it anyway, not searching for evidence anymore, just quietly proud of what an honest, boring, properly documented neighborhood is actually supposed to look like. We never did put another ceramic rooster on the porch. Not out of fear, but simply because we never needed to prove anything to anyone ever again. Instead, we planted a small garden along the walkway, ordinary and unremarkable, exactly the kind of quiet, uncontested detail a home is supposed to be allowed to have without becoming a battlefield over who gets to belong there. Almost 2 years after that first clipboard appeared uninvited on our porch, Brookstone Estates finally felt, completely and without qualification, like ours, not because we'd won some dramatic victory over a woman who'd once controlled an entire street through fear, but because we'd simply, stubbornly, documented every lie until the truth became impossible for anyone left to ignore. Looking back now, I sometimes think about all the families in Brookstone who paid Debbie's fake fines quietly over the years and simply moved away rather than fight. Families we'll never fully account for. Restitution checks that could never reach addresses long since sold to someone new. That unfinished part of the story stays with me more than any single triumphant courtroom moment ever could. The county, prompted partly by our case, eventually passed new oversight requirements for homeowners associations across the region, mandatory documented elections, public financial disclosures, formal channels for residents to report suspected officer fraud without needing an entire investigative folder built from scratch first. Small, unglamorous reforms. Exactly the kind that might have spared us, had they existed sooner. Marcus still gets the occasional message from strangers in other states, describing their own Debbies, asking quietly how to start documenting what's happening to them. He always answers the same simple way. Start today, save everything, and don't assume anyone else will believe you until you've built something undeniable. It's not glamorous advice. It's just the advice that actually worked for us. I think, sometimes, about how easily this could have gone differently. A different officer that night in our backyard. A different split-second decision. A different ending entirely. That thought never fully leaves me. Even now, even in peace. It just settles quietly alongside the gratitude, reminding me exactly how much was truly at stake underneath what once looked like petty neighborhood squabbling. Renee's grandson turned 12 that spring, celebrating his birthday with a backyard party that spilled cheerfully into the common area Debbie once policed so ruthlessly after dark. Watching him laugh freely under string lights, surrounded by neighbors who'd once been too afraid to defend him publicly, felt like the truest, quietest measure of everything that had actually changed in Brookstone Estates. Marcus and I still live in the same house, the same porch, the same ordinary street, though it feels entirely different now than it did the day we signed the closing papers. Naively certain a white picket fence was the finish line rather than simply the beginning of learning exactly what it takes to keep a home. And a neighborhood, honestly yours. People still ask us sometimes, half joking, whether we regret ever documenting that first ceramic rooster citation instead of simply letting it go the way so many neighbors before us had. We never do. Absurd fine was the first thread we pulled on an entire tapestry of quiet harm, and pulling it, however exhausting, was the only way anyone ever found the truth. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone standing where we once stood, frightened and uncertain in their own driveway, simply this: document everything. Trust your own eyes over anyone else's authority. And never assume a badge, a title, or a clipboard automatically means someone actually has the power they claim. Sometimes the loudest authority in the room has none at all. Brookstone Estates is just an ordinary neighborhood now, the way it always should have been: matching mailboxes, trimmed hedges, kids on bicycles, no one watching from a golf cart, no one deciding who belongs. Maya and Marcus Whitfield stayed, rebuilt, and never let a stolen title define their home again. The end.